Some conversations don't end badly, they just leave you feeling drained and unsure why. You finish certain conversations feeling unsettled, not angry, not offended, just slightly off. You replay what you said, the reasons you gave, the explanations you offered. There's a vague sense that you revealed more than necessary, that you worked harder in the exchange than the other person did. Nothing obvious went wrong, no argument, no raised voices, yet the other person seems calmer afterward, more settled in their position, while you feel exposed. This isn't about being articulate or thoughtful. It's about a recurring pattern where explanation becomes automatic, and the cost only shows up afterward. That lingering discomfort isn't confusion, it's information. Something shifted during the exchange, even if you can't name it yet. Explanation, when it isn't requested, functions as a social signal. It communicates that a position needs support, that a decision requires approval, that reasoning must be presented for judgment. The explanation itself isn't the issue, the timing is. When you explain without being asked, you reveal how you think, what pressures you respond to, and where you feel the need to justify yourself. Over time, this creates an imbalance. The other person gains insight into your internal process, while you gain nothing equivalent in return. What makes this pattern difficult to detect is that it's socially rewarded at first. Explanation looks polite, it appears cooperative, it signals openness and good faith. In early interactions, this can feel like connection, but as the pattern repeats, the meaning changes. The initial positive reception creates a false sense of security. People respond well to transparency. They appreciate being included in your reasoning. This reinforces the behavior, making it feel like the right approach. But beneath the surface, something else is happening. Each unsolicited explanation establishes a precedent. It quietly communicates that your decisions are open for discussion, that your boundaries are negotiable, that your choices require external validation to be complete. Over time, the dynamic crystallizes. What began as courtesy becomes obligation. What started as transparency becomes vulnerability. The pattern becomes self-reinforcing because breaking it suddenly feels withholding or defensive. The explanation stops being interpreted as generosity and starts being read as availability. Not availability of time, but availability of justification. It quietly establishes that your decisions are open for review, that your preferences can be evaluated, and that your boundaries depend on context rather than standing on their own. Reasonable people fall into this pattern because it feels responsible, because it feels like clarity prevents conflict, because withholding explanation can feel abrupt or unfriendly. But clarity offered too freely doesn't always stabilize the situation. Sometimes it destabilizes it. The destabilization happens gradually. Each explanation provides a map of your decision-making process. Others learn which factors influence you, which arguments carry weight, and where uncertainty exists. This knowledge becomes leverage. They know how to frame requests, how to present information, and how to position their needs in ways that align with your revealed priorities. The 5 situations. First situation, declining an invitation or request. You say no to an event, a favor, or an added responsibility. Almost immediately, you follow with reasons. You explain your schedule, your workload, your constraints. The explanation feels considerate. It feels like you're softening the refusal. Over time, something subtle happens. The other person learns that your no is provisional, that it's tied to conditions that can be questioned, negotiated, or reframed. They don't hear a decision. They hear an obstacle to overcome. Future requests arrive with counters prepared in advance because your explanations taught them where to apply pressure. What the other person learns is that your refusals come with blueprints for reversal. When you explain that you're too busy, they learn that availability is the key variable. When you cite other commitments, they learn that priority ranking matters. Each explanation becomes a roadmap for future persuasion attempts. The expectation quietly shifts from acceptance to negotiation. Your no is no longer received as final information. It becomes the opening position in a discussion. Others begin to probe automatically, not because they're pushy, but because your pattern of explanation has taught them that reasons can be addressed, circumstances can be altered, and decisions can be revisited. This dynamic becomes harder to reverse because changing it requires disappointing people who have grown accustomed to access. When you eventually stop explaining your refusals, it feels abrupt to those who have learned to expect context. Second situation, making a decision that affects others. You choose a direction, adjust a plan, or change an arrangement. Instead of stating the decision, you walk through your reasoning. You list the factors you considered. You show that the choice was thoughtful. Repeated often enough, this trains an expectation. Decisions are no longer received as settled. They're treated as drafts. Others learn that your conclusions arrive open-ended, awaiting feedback or revision. The more transparent your reasoning becomes, the more others feel entitled to weigh in on it. What others learn is that your decisions are collaborative by default. When you consistently share your reasoning process, they begin to see themselves as participants rather than recipients. They learn which factors you prioritize, which concerns carry weight, and where your logic might be challenged. The expectation shifts from implementation to consultation. Others begin to offer input automatically, not because they are overstepping, but because your transparency has positioned them as stakeholders in your decision-making process. They feel invited to comment, to suggest alternatives, to point out considerations you might have missed. This becomes harder to reverse because others have grown comfortable with their advisory role. When you begin making decisions without sharing your reasoning, they feel excluded from a process they've come to see as partially theirs. Third situation, expressing a preference or opinion. You mention that you don't enjoy something or that you see an issue differently. Then you justify it. You add context. You explain why your view makes sense. Over time, this frames your preferences as arguments rather than facts. Instead of being accepted as personal, they're evaluated for coherence. Agreement becomes conditional on whether your reasoning satisfies someone else's standards. The preference itself loses weight unless it's backed by logic. What others learn is that your preferences are debatable positions rather than personal truths. When you consistently justify your likes and dislikes, you teach others that these positions are open for evaluation. They learn to assess the quality of your reasoning rather than simply accepting your preferences as information about who you are. The expectation shifts from acceptance to analysis. Others begin to challenge your preferences automatically, not because they're argumentative, but because your pattern of justification has framed these as intellectual positions rather than personal facts. This becomes harder to reverse because others have learned to see your preferences as starting points for discussion rather than endpoints. When you stop justifying your likes and dislikes, they interpret this as being unreasonable or closed-minded. Fourth situation, setting a boundary or limit. You state that you're unavailable for certain interactions or unwilling to participate in specific dynamics. Then you explain your capacity, your circumstances, or your past experiences. What this teaches is that your limits are situational, that they exist because of temporary factors, not because they are firm. Others learn to wait for conditions to change or to challenge whether those conditions still apply. The boundary becomes something to interpret rather than something to accept. What others learn is that your boundaries have expiration dates. When you explain that you can't do something because of current circumstances, they learn that changed circumstances might yield different results. Your explanations transform firm boundaries into conditional ones. The expectation shifts from respect to monitoring. Others begin to track whether the conditions that created your boundaries still exist. They watch for signs that your circumstances have changed, that your capacity has increased, or that your past experiences have been superseded by new ones. This becomes harder to reverse because others have learned to see your boundaries as puzzles to solve rather than walls to respect. When you stop explaining your limits, they interpret this as being arbitrary or unfair. Fifth situation, responding to criticism or questioning. Someone challenges your decision or questions your judgment. You respond by explaining your reasoning, clarifying your intent, or defending your process. Repeated over time, this accepts a quiet premise that their disapproval requires resolution, that their assessment carries authority. The explanation shifts the interaction from exchange to evaluation. You're no longer discussing ideas, you're being reviewed. What others learn is that their questioning has power over you. When you consistently respond to challenges with detailed explanations, you teach them that their disapproval creates an obligation for you to justify yourself. They learn that expressing doubt or criticism will reliably produce access to your internal reasoning process. The expectation shifts from dialogue to audit. Others begin to question your decisions automatically, not because they're genuinely confused, but because your pattern of response has taught them that questioning yields information and influence. This becomes harder to reverse because others have grown accustomed to their evaluative role. When you stop automatically explaining yourself in response to criticism, they interpret this as defensiveness or arrogance. The immediate cost is informational. Each explanation gives away leverage. It reveals how you decide, what persuades you, and where uncertainty lives. This makes you more predictable, and predictability in social dynamics often reduces influence. The informational cost extends beyond simple transparency. Each unsolicited explanation provides others with a detailed map of your psychological landscape. They learn which arguments move you, which pressures you respond to, and which emotional appeals carry weight. This knowledge accumulates over time, creating an asymmetric relationship where others understand your internal process while you remain largely ignorant of theirs. The predictability that results isn't just about knowing what you'll decide, it's about knowing how to influence what you'll decide. Others learn to frame their requests in language that aligns with your revealed values, to present information in ways that trigger your known concerns, and to time their approaches for maximum effectiveness. The deeper cost is internal. Over time, explanation trains self-doubt. Decisions begin to feel incomplete until they are explained. You start anticipating questions before they are asked, rehearsing justifications in advance. Mental bandwidth is consumed not by the decision itself, but by the defense of it. This internal shift happens gradually and often goes unnoticed until it becomes severe. The cognitive load of constant justification preparation becomes background noise, a persistent drain on mental resources. You begin to evaluate decisions not just on their merits, but on how defensible they'll be. The anticipatory justification becomes particularly costly. You find yourself crafting explanations for decisions that haven't been questioned, preparing defenses for positions that haven't been challenged. Mental energy that could be directed toward productive thinking gets redirected toward imaginary debates. This erodes decisiveness. Choices take longer. Confidence thins. The tolerance for being misunderstood drops, because misunderstanding now feels like a threat rather than a neutral outcome. Reactivity increases. Silence becomes uncomfortable. You feel compelled to correct assumptions even when doing so changes nothing. The discomfort with being misunderstood becomes particularly problematic. When explanation becomes habitual, the natural human tolerance for ambiguity atrophies. You lose the ability to let others hold incorrect assumptions about your motivations or reasoning. A feedback loop forms. The more you explain, the more explanation is expected. The less you explain, the more abrupt it feels. Others grow accustomed to access, while you grow accustomed to exposure. What began as clarity becomes obligation. The shift happens internally before it becomes visible. When explanation stops being automatic, decisions begin to stand on their own. Others receive less access to the reasoning behind choices, and over time, the expectation of justification weakens. This internal shift often begins with simple awareness. Recognizing the pattern is the first step toward changing it. You begin to notice the automatic impulse to explain, the reflexive justification that follows decisions. This awareness creates a pause, a moment of choice between old patterns and new possibilities. As the internal shift stabilizes, the external changes become apparent. Conversations require less preparation. Decisions feel complete without external validation. The mental energy previously devoted to anticipatory justification becomes available for other purposes. Authority changes character. It becomes quieter, less performative. Not because information is withheld, but because it's no longer offered reflexively. Decisions don't gain weight through explanation. They gain weight through consistency. This quieter authority often surprises people who have grown accustomed to the explained version. Decisions that stand without justification carry different weight than decisions that come with detailed reasoning. They feel more final, less negotiable. The consistency aspect becomes crucial. When decisions are made and held without extensive explanation, patterns emerge. Others learn to trust your judgment not because they understand your reasoning, but because your track record speaks for itself. As this pattern stabilizes, the dynamic rebalances. Conversations require less defense. Fewer debates form around settled matters. Explanation returns to its proper role. Something exchanged when requested, not something volunteered to secure approval. The rebalancing happens gradually and often goes unnoticed by others. They simply find themselves accepting your decisions more readily, questioning your judgment less frequently, and feeling less entitled to detailed explanations. Nothing dramatic happens. There's no confrontation, no announcement, just a gradual reduction in the effort required to hold your position. And with it, a reduction in the drain that once followed certain conversations. The reduction in effort becomes noticeable over time. Conversations that once left you feeling drained begin to feel neutral or even energizing. The mental preparation that once preceded difficult interactions becomes unnecessary. Most significantly, the drain that once followed certain conversations disappears. You finish interactions feeling settled rather than unsettled, complete rather than exposed. The vague sense of having revealed too much is replaced by a quiet confidence in having shared exactly what was necessary and nothing more.